Welcome to the deep dive. Pull up a chair, because today we're taking a fascinating journey into the history and complex realities of Nepal.
We've been digging into some pretty detailed academic writing for this one. Gives us a really grounded look at Nepal's past and present.
And our mission is clear: to cut through the noise and extract the most important insights, some truly surprising facts, and key connections to help you understand this absolutely unique country. It's a place that's been profoundly shaped by its incredible geography and history, nestled right between two global giants. We're going to cover everything these sources lay out, from the earliest traces of inhabitants all the way up to the challenges it faces today.
Okay, let's jump right in then. The very first thing that grabs you when you look at Nepal is its geography. It's completely landlocked.
Right, bordered by India on three sides: east, south, and west.
And by the mighty Himalayas and the Tibet Autonomous Region of China to the north.
And the sources really emphasize how this creates three incredibly distinct geographical zones within the country itself.
Exactly. Yeah. Up north, you have the Greater Himalayas. This is home to some of the world's highest peaks. Sagarmatha, that's Mount Everest, of course.
Of course.
Plus Kanchenjunga, Lhotse, Makalu, Dhaulagiri, and Manaslu. Think steep mountains, alpine meadows, crucial watersheds, that sort of thing.
Below that is the Middle Hill region, dropping down steeply from, 600 up to 5,000 meters?
Right. And finally, the flat Terai Plains stretch across the south.
Okay.
This is Nepal's most densely populated area, and its absolute grain basket.
It makes sense then that the climate varies massively, from tropical and subtropical in the south up to freezing cold in the high Himalayas.
The sources mention that distinct rainy season, too, hitting from June to late September.
And those rivers, fed by all that snowmelt, they're a defining feature.
Well, absolutely. Some are shorter, like the Bagmati and Bishnamati. Others are major systems, like the Gagara, Karnali, and Koshi.
And they carry heavy sediment, creating those fertile Terai plains.
Exactly. But they also carve out incredibly steep gorges in the hills. Really dramatic landscapes.
So how does this dramatic landscape connect to Nepal's history? The sources suggest it's, fundamental.
It really is. Being landlocked and having those immense mountain barriers to the north, historically, it limited certain kinds of invasions, but it also fostered regional isolation within Nepal itself. Different valleys and regions developed quite distinctly.
You see that echoed throughout its history, don't you? Even in modern political challenges.
Absolutely. It's a recurring theme.
That makes sense. Let's talk about the deep, deep past, though. Echoes from what the sources call deep time.
Yeah, we're talking way before written history here. Archaeological evidence indicates human settlement in the Himalayan region over 30,000 years ago.
Wow.
The sources point to specific stone tools found near the Rudraksha Valley, dated to the Upper Paleolithic, maybe around 10,000 BC.
And closer to home for many, those Neolithic etching stones right there in the Kathmandu Valley, places like Swayambhunath, Hadi, Sanku, Pashupati.
Yes, those are dated significantly later, around 5,000 BC. Now, when we get to the earliest known inhabitants with actual written records, the sources identify the Kirati people.
They arrived around 500 BC, apparently soon after developing their own inscriptions, and settled mainly in the eastern regions near the Koshi River.
Right. And related boat people migrated north into those hilly regions we just talked about.
Okay.
The sources mention that following the Kirati around 300 BC were the Drake kings. They ruled the Kathmandu Valley and pop up in Hindu texts.
But it's interesting, the source material specifically notes a lack of architectural remains from that Drake period.
Yeah, a bit of a historical blank spot there, architecturally speaking. The sources then highlight Emperor Ashoka's purported visit to Kathmandu.
Ashoka, from India.
The very same. Mentioning the erection of 4 stone slabs or pillars with edicts about 2,000 years ago. The inscription on these pillars apparently has linguistic links to the ancient Gupta script.
Okay, that brings us to a really significant period the sources call the Golden Age, the Licchavi period.
This emerges around the 7th century CE in what's considered Nepal proper. And these weren't the same Licchavis as the dynasty in India, apparently.
Oh, different group.
Yeah, a distinct group who migrated and arrived in the Kathmandu Valley when it was a much different place, described as marshy and forested.
Right.
They essentially claimed the land and began building extensively cities, temples, monuments.
And they held sway as sovereign kings in the valley for roughly 500 years. King Gunakarmadeva is mentioned as an early figure, possibly first half of the 7th century.
That's the one. The sources paint this as a time of remarkable prosperity and development in the valley. We're talking significant growth in art, literature, and culture.
And what's striking is how many temples from this period still stand today, often in their original forms.
That resilience is pretty amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Specific architectural examples the sources point to are the iconic stupas of Swayambhu and Buddha,
Icons.
and the beautiful Vishankhu Narayan, described as a Kunda temple that's a water tank temple with these exquisite carved plaques. Kiratipur was also apparently a Licchavi capital.
Okay.
Yes, and many of the ancient stone and metal art objects you still find in temples across the valley trace back to this vibrant Licchavi era.
So after this golden age, who steps onto the scene?
That's the Malla kingdoms.
Right.
The Malla dynasty, the name means wrestler, interestingly enough.
Wrestler, okay.
Yeah, a powerful Kshatriya group that rose to prominence from the 12th century onwards. They came from the Terai region initially.
Ah, from the south.
Right. And ruled various kingdoms like Bhaktapur, Lalitpur, and Kathmandu. The sources note that their empire eventually fragmented, and independent kingdoms also popped up in the Terai.
The sources seem to focus quite a bit on Bhaktapur during this time.
Yes, established by King Jayasthiti Malla, and particularly highlighting a new era of prosperity under King Bhupatendra Malla. He seems to have been very civic-minded, according to the sources.
Oh, so what did he do?
Well, he had a keen interest in urban development, maintained good relations with Delhi, and even implemented strict cleanliness laws, imagine that, centuries ago.
Ahead of his time.
Seems like it. He developed ponds and irrigation systems, open paths, and really fostered the cultural scene by organizing festivals like Gyalnath and Chath, and introducing various specific dances like Natyaksha, Bhairav Natak, and Mashi Natak.
It sounds like a real period of investment in the city.
Absolutely. And the sources emphasize the role of skilled artisans who poured their talent into stone, wood, and metalwork, truly enriching the city's appearance.
Right.
The Malla era saw this dramatic rise in architecture and culture, laying the very foundations of the Bhaktapur you see today and building the famous Bhaktapur Durbar Square.
The list of architectural marvels is impressive. The 5-story Vatsalaya Mandir is called a masterpiece, plus Satal, Basantapur, Bimsanthan, the 55-panch building, Vatsala Narayan Temple, City Lakshmi Temple, Banshadukhan Bhairav Temple, and that magnificent Golden Gate.
And all those stone carvings and jeweled towers.
Yeah.
It really speaks to the wealth and artistic focus of the time. What's also fascinating, according to the sources, is the detail about how the state was organized, divided into 24 districts or amchas, and the significance of Indrajatra celebrations.
Right, including the ritualistic act of kings riding horses, stopping, and sipping water at different points.
Exactly. That kind of specific detail.
So this seems like a high point for these city-states. How does the rise of the Gorkha Kingdom change things?
This is where we see the path towards modern Nepal begin to forge. The Gorkha Kingdom was founded by King Dravya Shah in 1559 AD.
Okay.
The Shah dynasty originated in the Khasa Hill region and had moved into the hills.
There's that detail about Jayasthiti Malla of Lalitpur being worried about Gorkha and invading using bundled armies and bounty hunters.
Right, there was conflict, but Dravya Shah ultimately conquered the area in 1559. The sources indicate the period immediately after his reign was challenging, with complex internal dynamics and power struggles, land grants, challenges to rule, that sort of thing.
The key figure for unification, though, is King Prithvi Narayan Shah.
Precisely. His era is defined by this motto of uniting the nation, primarily through force. The sources describe his determination, mentioning what some saw as a profligate war against Kiratipur nobis.
Profligate. Strong word.
Yeah, but the king apparently viewed it as crucial for disconnecting from certain rivals. The 7-horse care is mentioned in the source. The sources also note his strong religious motivation as a devout Hindu, attributing a sacrosanct status to the Kali deity, which was apparently central to the First Battle of Kiratipur.
Okay, so how did this Gorkha drive turn these fragmented kingdoms into the country we know today?
Well, the present-day territory of Nepal, about 147,516 square kilometers, was pieced together through the political unification of 8 smaller states between 1743 and 1779.
And Gorkha was the leader in this.
The undisputed leader of this process, yeah. The sources mention the Gorkha area itself had seen prior settlement attempts by Mullah kings before later clans from the Gangetic Plain settled there. King Prithvi Narayan Shah's focused unification efforts really kicked off after disputes arose following his father's death in 1722.
Okay.
The sources even include this fascinating story about his religious teacher, Ranganatha, and a ritual involving cutting hair in a 9-stringed thread.
A ritual?
Yeah, linked to a promise to fulfill the king's desires, presumably his ambitions for expansion.
And that promise seems to be connected to his persistent attempts to conquer Kirtipur.
Absolutely. The sources detail multiple tries. An initial failure in 1744, a partial victory in 1745, and the final successful occupation in 1746.
So, third time lucky.
Basically, taking Kirtipur was strategic. The sources say it prepared him to then occupy Kathmandu in 1750 and Patan in 1751, what they call the Twin Cities.
His expansion didn't stop there, though.
No, his territorial reach grew significantly. By around 1751, he had expanded into Makwanpur and other areas in the south and Midwest.
Right.
The sources also mention the invasion of the western part, inhabited by Khasa people, in 1756.
And the unification process itself wasn't finished under him. It was completed by his sons.
Correct. His sons continued the work, King Pratap Singh Shah in the east around 1773, and then King Rana Bahadur Shah also completing territory in the east around 1790.
So, from a unified kingdom under the Shahs, the sources take us to a dramatic and pretty abrupt shift in power, the Rana era.
Yeah, this period started very suddenly with the Khat massacre of 1846.
The Khat massacre.
The sources describe it vividly as the elimination of the royal family and much of the elite nobility in a vicious power struggle. Just brutal.
And young Bahadur Kunwar emerges victorious from this chaos.
Yes, he was an adopted son of Vimsan Thapa and rose to absolute power. He really solidified his position.
Oh.
Well, he even acquired titles like Rana from Queen Victoria and Maha Maharaja from the British.
Right.
The sources note how this effectively isolated the Shah king politically, while young Bahadur himself became this kind of popular figure.
Which the sources say, paradoxically, sowed the seeds for a Republican movement that would eventually challenge the Rana regime.
Precisely. That public visibility and his absolute power created an opposition over time. There's mention of a satyagraha against young Bahadur in 1892.
A non-violent protest.
Yeah. And a weekly newspaper, Surodaya, that dared to directly insult the Rana rulers. Pretty gutsy.
The sources include a quite striking, almost unsettling detail about Yum Bahadur's Mahapuja at Narayan Hidi Palace.
It's a vivid example from the sources illustrating his power and the public's reaction. His mother was dressed as goddess Bhagwati for this ritual.
Okay.
The sources state the conscious people of the capital mocked this as Bhagwati Niyo,
Good to hear.
which enraged Jung Bahadur, leading to a response involving animal slaughter and blood flow, described as an action to quell the ridicule. It really highlights the tension simmering beneath the surface.
Definitely. This brings us to the modern era, marked by prolonged struggles for democracy and, tragically, civil war.
The People's Movement in 1990 was a pivotal moment. It led to multi-party democracy after decades of direct royal rule.
Right. Driven by widespread discontent against King Birendra's autocratic panchayat system.
Organized by the Nepal People's Movement Committee.
This was a mass movement, wasn't it? Led by the Nepali Congress and the Communist Party of Nepal, UML. Involved intense agitation.
Yeah, violent agitation, according to the sources. It forced the monarchy to concede power in the face of overwhelming public demand.
The key outcome was the Constitution of 1990. Established a parliamentary system, multi-party democracy, constitutional monarchy.
Right, effectively shifting executive power from the king to the prime minister.
The stated aims were clear. Govern based on the people's wishes, protect rights and liberty. The sources mention something called the Constitution Entrenchments Mechanism.
Ah, yes.
And suggest that the resistance to amendment makes Nepal a potential model for diverse societies. Can you elaborate on what the source means by that mechanism and why a model?
Sure. The sources describe the entrenchments mechanism as clauses within the Constitution that are deliberately difficult to amend. They often require supermajority votes or even referendums.
Okay, harder to change.
Exactly. In the context of Nepal's deep ethnic and political divisions, the idea, as presented in the source, is that these entrenched clauses were intended to protect the rights and representation of diverse groups, to prevent easy changes that could disadvantage minorities.
I see.
Now, calling it a model might be a strong claim, given the later instability, but the sources are highlighting the intent behind making certain foundational elements hard to alter, hoping to build long-term stability in a very diverse society, even though, implementation faced huge challenges.
Speaking of diversity, the sources are very clear about Nepal's incredible ethnic landscape.
Oh, it's immensely diverse. Khas Brahmins, Chetris, and numerous indigenous groups or Janajadis like Nepalese Indians, Newars, Tibetas, Sherpas, Tamangs, Limbus, Mashis, Boats, many others.
And the sources note that managing this diversity, avoiding ethnic-based and identity politics, has been a major, major challenge.
A huge challenge.
Yeah.
And that challenge became tragically apparent with the Civil War. The sources note the war, lasting over 10 years. It had roots in the historical context of failed attempts to modernize the feudal state, and maybe a reluctance among elites to adopt Enlightenment ideals that would have allowed for genuine inclusion.
A turning point mentioned is the horrific assassination of King Birendra and the royal family massacre in June 2001.
Yeah, that event was just shocking. It led to Gyanendra becoming king, and the sources describe him as having a more traditionalist, sort of feudalistic mindset.
Okay.
The sources explain that the partial democratization in the late 1990s, while intended positively, also inadvertently created space for all political forces.
Including
What we describe as an insignificant rebel group at the time, inspired by Maoist ideology, the CPNM.
which then escalated into the Civil War. And the sources highlight King Gyanendra's actions in February 2005 as a major step backwards.
It was essentially a royal coup d'etat. He took direct control, dismissed the elected government led by PM Sher Bahadur Doba, dissolved the parliament, banned public gatherings and media, and unleashed state violence against activists using the Royal Nepalese Army. A real crackdown.
So how did Nepal move from that point to the republic it is today?
That was the result of the Jana Andolan II movement in 2006. This second mass mobilization was powerful enough to force the abolition of the monarchy altogether.
Completely gone.
Completely gone, and establish a democratic republic.
Mhm.
This paved the way for the first Maoist-led government and the promulgation of the new constitution on September 20, 2015.
The sources describe this as a massive, almost revolutionary shift from the pre-2006 feudalistic system.
It was profound. We're talking about the abolition of the state throne, even the physical demolition of the 9-story royal palace. Symbolic and actual changes aiming to establish a federal democratic republican system based on mass mobilization.
But the sources are quite stark about what followed this seemingly revolutionary moment.
Yes, despite the major constitutional change, the sources emphasize the significant political instability that has persisted. It didn't just magically fix everything.
Citing things like parliament purges, chief justice raids, questions about legitimacy, issues with presidential selection, and ongoing opposition to constitutional amendments.
Exactly. This chronic instability and unresolved issues are why the sources, in parts, even regard Nepal as potentially a failed state.
Strong term.
Very. Pointing to symptoms like the lack of a single-party majority for years, instances of what's described as a PM monopoly, and the unimplemented upper house of parliament. Just a lot of dysfunction.
The main paper we looked at frames this instability within a deeper collateral inquiry.
Yes, it examines the autocratic era, the brief 1951 democracy, the long-standing pattern of political imbalance, the Civil War, and the turbulent post-Civil War developments. Trying to understand the root causes of this persistent instability.
This history of upheaval is also reflected in Nepal's constitutional journey, which isn't exactly a straight line, is it?
Not at all. The 1990 constitution was actually the fifth. The first was in 1948.
Right.
But King Mahendra used emergency powers to revoke the slightly more democratic 1951 constitution in 1960.
Which ushered in the 1962 partyless Panchayat democracy constitution that lasted until 1990. What exactly did partyless mean in practice under the Panchayat system, according to the source?
Good question. The sources explain that partyless meant that political parties were officially banned.
Banned outright.
Yes. The Panchayat system was designed as this pyramid structure of local and national assemblies where representatives were supposedly chosen on merit, not party affiliation.
Supposedly.
Right. In practice, the sources indicate this system concentrated power firmly in the monarchy and suppressed any organized political opposition.
Got it. The struggles and debates around the framing of the 1990 Constitution also reflected that underlying uncertainty about the future.
Yeah, the sources highlight that the debates showed significant division over the country's fundamental political direction and, crucially, the precise role the monarch should play going forward.
Still a question mark.
Definitely. The study divides this constitutional development into periods: pre-1951, 1951-1960, and 1961-1990.
And the source's conclusion on these later constitutions is quite pointed.
It is. It notes that while the 1962 and 1990 constitutions provided written legal frameworks resembling modern nation-states, the internal environment, the political culture, the power struggles, the deep-seated divisions made it incredibly difficult for a genuine bicameral democracy or a truly sovereign Nepal, free from external influence or internal conflict, to actually take root.
So the structure was there on paper, but the reality was different.
Pretty much, yeah.
Amidst this complex political history, Nepal is also renowned for its incredible cultural riches.
Absolutely. And what's remarkable, the sources explain, is how much of this heritage has survived centuries of upheaval and natural challenges.
They attribute this longevity to deep-rooted practices of maintenance and repair.
Exactly. Supported by patrons like the royal family, ministers, and donors, often motivated by seeking dignity or religious meridharma.
Right.
Historic inscriptions actually record these acts of upkeep. Institutions like Guthis were key communal organizations specifically tasked with the upkeep of buildings.
Guthis. Okay. And the Chen Bottle Institution from the Malla period served a similar purpose, repairing edifices.
Yes, these were built into the social fabric. It wasn't just random. The sources note that before the 1950s, Nepal's relative isolation meant large-scale conservation wasn't such a pressing issue.
Less wear and tear, maybe?
Perhaps. But opening up afterwards accelerated the pace of change and necessitated more formal efforts.
Early efforts came from groups like Nirman Samaitis and the Public Works Department. The Department of Archaeology was established in 1952-53.
And the sources give a specific example. The very first major repair by the Due was on the Kastamandapa Temple, a joint effort with the Guthi Sandstone providing funds.
Collaboration.
Collaboration with the Guthi Jirnadar Tatha Nirman Samiti from 1967 further boosted conservation initiatives.
But despite this long history and dedicated efforts, the sources highlight significant challenges in heritage conservation today.
They do. They point to inadequacy at the local government level, lack of human resources, and insufficient participation from the public or users of the sites.
That's tough.
And a particularly concerning point is the mention of power struggles and ego clashes among cultural agencies and experts actually harming some conservation efforts.
Oh, that's frustrating. The sources also mention local governments lacking de facto authority.
Right.
The private sector operating within limited frameworks like the Nepal Tourism Board or Kathmandu Valley Development Authority. And the fact that a heritage conservation bill drafted way back in 1995 still hasn't been enacted.
Still not enacted. Along with unimplemented schemes, procedural complications, and the lack of comprehensive GIS mapping for heritage assets, it paints a picture of systemic obstacles preventing really effective preservation.
A lot of hurdles. Shifting gears slightly to another vital aspect of the environment and biodiversity.
The sources provide a frankly quite concerning assessment here. Despite Nepal's immense ecological importance due to its geography, its biodiversity is described as rapidly degraded.
Listing causes like population growth, land use changes, tourism, poaching, pollution, infrastructure projects. The usual suspects, sadly.
Yeah. And a stark warning is given. Catastrophe cannot be ruled out, and existing protected areas are simply insufficient to halt the decline.
That's sobering. What is positive, though, is the stated evolution of environmental policy over the past decade or so.
Right. The sources note Nepal ratifying 6 international biodiversity agreements back in 1994.
Okay.
Endorsing the Environmental Protection Act, prioritizing biodiversity inventory, and initiating surveys of medicinal plants. So there's policy recognition.
But the on-the-ground challenges are immense.
Immense. And perhaps linked back to some of the governance issues we just discussed. It's all interconnected.
Let's touch on Nepal's complex foreign relations, particularly during critical periods.
The sources offer some interesting details about how King Tribhuwan navigated foreign matters, apparently trying to balance royal authority with public and national sentiment.
Tricky balance.
Very. Consulting with Congress and Praja Parishad chiefs. There's that specific event where the king actually left Kathmandu with help from the Indian government.
Right, I remember that. And upon his return, the sources say he dismissed the Nepali Congress cabinet, appointed Rana instead, and stopped public consultation on the constitution.
Exactly, which led to a constitution drafted in 2009 BS that reflected the king's wishes. The sources note it implied excessive territory, whatever that specifically meant in that context. The sources detail controversy here, saying the king treated Nepali diplomats poorly and even seemed to cede powers to India's Home Department.
Really?
Which reportedly led to his dismissal by the then Congress government.
The king's proposal for establishing the Mukti Sena also seems to have been contentious. What was the Mukti Sena?
It translates roughly to Liberation Army. Yes, the sources describe it as a hot issue, seen primarily as the king's or Congress's internal business, raising questions about its true purpose and control.
Okay, and there are unsettling reports mentioned in the source, the king apparently contacting people near the Tibet border for arms and troops against Congress.
Yeah. even offering prizes for catching Congress soldiers. It highlights the deep mistrust and intense power struggles that characterize that period, with the monarchy seemingly willing to seek external or irregular support against internal political rivals.
Definitely turbulent times. Moving to something perhaps more unifying, Nepal has a rich array of national symbols.
It truly does. The sources emphasize these symbols as representing national identity and pride. They list the flag, anthem, emblem, flower, tree, bird, animal.
A whole list.
Poisonous plant, interesting one. Fruit, pashmina, and language.
And the sources note that Nepal was officially declared a republican and secular nation in 2008 AD, August-September time, Bhadra 3rd, 2065 BS.
Right. And efforts have been made, according to the sources, to simplify complex concepts and document information about these symbols to ensure broader knowledge and preservation among the population.
Good idea.
The sources stress that these aren't just simple images, they hold deep meaning and represent the priceless and incommensurable wealth of the nation.
This brings us back to the diverse ethnic landscape we touched on earlier, but let's go a bit deeper into the details provided in the sources.
Okay. The sources broadly categorize Nepal's people into Madhesi, Pahadi, and Himalayan groups, reflecting the geographic zones and migration patterns.
The Terai region is described as a settler region with North Indian people and culture, referred to as Madhesi, many historically migrating, called Avadi. It's flat and fertile.
Examples listed include groups like Tharu, Yadav, Kurmi Muslims, and later Bahuni and Nowar businessmen also migrated there.
The hilly region is primarily home to Pahadi people who migrated from the north and mid-hills.
Right. The sources list examples like Magars, Gurungs, and Rayas. Settlement was often made possible by clearing forests.
Deforestation playing a role there.
Yeah. And later migrations happened for jobs and business after roads improved connectivity.
And the Himalayan region is where you find groups like Sherpa, Bodhi, Sampang, and Tamang, who historically migrated from Tibet.
Exactly. They settled in various higher altitude areas, engaging in livestock, collecting herbs, and increasingly tourism.
Tourism is big there.
Big source of income. The sources note Sherpas are famous climbers, of course, and Tamangs were significant as native language speakers and religious priests in their communities.
The sources point out that Nepal's ethnic diversity fundamentally represents an intermixture of Indo-Aryan and Mongoloid races.
Yes. Reflected in the major language families present Indo-European for groups like Newar, Kaz, Licchavi, Limbu, and others, and Tibeto-Burman for groups like Rai, Tamang, Gurung, Sherpa, and Vote. It's a real mix.
And this diversity isn't just in ethnicity and language. The sources highlight it's expressed in culture, religion, dialects, scripts, festivals, dress, and food across the country.
It creates this incredibly rich, layered social tapestry. Despite a relatively small population of around 26 million, the sources emphasize that Nepal is profoundly multicultural, a variety of religions, beliefs, heritages.
And they highlight a perhaps surprising aspect given the ethnic diversity, religious harmony, and harmonious coexistence, generally speaking.
Yes. Despite the complex social structure, communities representing Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Jainism, Sikhism, and Christianity generally coexist peacefully.
That's positive.
It is. The sources note the non-Hindu populations are growing and that freedom of religion is constitutionally guaranteed by the 2015 Constitution.
The sources state that religious beliefs and practices deeply influence all aspects of society laws, politics, economics, and culture.
Absolutely. The vast majority are Hindu, and historically, Hinduism was the official state religion, according to the sources.
You see the religious influence everywhere, right? The abundance of Hindu temples and Buddhist stupas and shrines across all geographical zones.
Exactly. They're not just places of worship, but are recognized as cultural heritage, noted for their architecture. Popular pilgrimage sites include Koshi, Lumbini, Shakya, Manikel, and Sinduli.
The sources also delve into specific, perhaps less commonly known, religious categories, using the term disguisedly inclusive to describe mother goddess practice. What do the sources mean by disguisedly inclusive in this context? That's an unusual phrase.
It is an intriguing phrase in the source, isn't it? It seems to refer to how certain local or folk religious practices, like the worship of various forms of the mother goddess Shakti, Shalagram, Bhairav, Ashur, might be outwardly presented within the broader framework of Hinduism or Buddhism.
Okay.
But they maintain their distinct rituals, language, and symbol systems specific to certain communities or traditions. The disguised part might suggest these practices maintain a unique identity even while coexisting within or alongside the dominant religious structures.
Yeah.
Kind of hidden in plain sight, maybe.
That's fascinating. And the sources also mention Tibetan cultural practices being encoded within Buddhism, linking groups like the Sherpa and other ethnicities, even noting a historical tradition of capturing common land via tantric methods in Buddhist monastic villages.
Yeah, it just underscores the sheer complexity and localized variations within Nepal's religious landscape. It's not monolithic at all.
Perhaps the most visible expression of this vibrant cultural tapestry is Nepal's calendar of festivals.
Oh, definitely. The sources describe Nepal as a land of innumerable festivals and celebrations, adding immense delight to life.
And they are dual purpose, aren't they? Occasions for tremendous festivities and gaiety, but also rigorous religious observance and spiritual endeavors.
Exactly. And the unique charm, the sources say, comes from the coexistence of cultures, religions, and races, and the blending of traditions.
Practices vary significantly by region, ethnicity, and religion, but they are generally celebrated with much pomposity and gaiety, offering a release from routine worries.
People dress up in their finest clothes, sometimes reviving old items. The sources specifically highlight the importance of prog for Nepali women.
Prog.
Yeah, describing various ornaments like pragas, dumukis, diamond and gold pieces, and the decorated marketplaces. It sounds very vibrant.
Some of the most venerated celebrations listed are Ganesh Chaturthi, Dashain, which is the national celebration.
It's a big one, yeah. Then Tihar, Holi, Phagu Purnima, Lakshmi Puja, Manushu, and Maiga Sankranti, plus numerous tribal celebrations.
The sources give specific examples. Dashain's significance even in remote regions. Ganesh Chaturthi blending gaiety and devotion.
Tihar's reverence for gods, and major events like Radha Makendranath and Indra Jatra with their impressive chariot processions. Real spectacles.
They even mention tribal celebrations like Sithamukh, Jongkon, and Khadka Raju, which can involve practices like killing rats and snakes as part of rituals and making life promises.
Yes, reflecting the deep connection between these rituals and the daily lives or beliefs of specific tribes. Not always pretty, maybe, but deeply embedded.
Sure. Other events mentioned range from Bhaktapur Jatra to Christmas, New Year, and various anniversaries.
It's a packed calendar, and the sources summarize the intrinsic values of these festivals as promoting good health and wealth, strengthening relationships, fostering happiness, cleanliness, development, and prosperity.
A whole range of benefits.
Alongside a resurgence of spirituality, morality, and harmony. It's clear they are central to the social and spiritual fabric of the country.
The Kathmandu Valley, in particular, is singled out in the sources for its incredible art and architecture.
Yes. It's described as a place of a new beginning for art and architecture, exhibiting truly original and inventive styles, heavily relying on local materials like wood, stone, terracotta, clay, and metal.
Speaks to a deep-seated creativity.
And aesthetic consciousness, yeah. The sources even call the valley a nursery and laboratory of art.
Why a laboratory?
Because it was a place where different traditions were assimilated, leading to the evolution of unique forms. The Malla kings, in particular, are credited with initiating this period of intense artistic creativity.
We talked about them earlier.
Right. Filling the valley with art and architecture, driven by their patronage and apparently competitive building efforts between the different Malla kingdoms.
You see this in the forms the intricate wood-carved and stone-carved temples, the paved courtyards. The sources even mention one building called Calendar that is described as resembling a Western castle. That seems a bit unusual.
Yes, that particular description in the source is perhaps a bit unexpected, maybe a translation thing or just a unique structure, but it does highlight the diverse architectural expressions. The unique three-tier, 8-pagoda Buddhanath stupa is certainly highlighted as a major monument.
Definitely. The sources explain there was a convention where monuments were often constructed corresponding to the size of the deity, reliquary, or shikara size, covering types like Badar, shikaras, chaitas, viharas, stupas, Vara Bhagawati temples, palaces, and tombs, a whole typology.
And the details are exquisite. The sources mention intricate frieze, figural, and floral motifs on wood panels with lotus columns. They point to the cast bronze Ratnasuk Bhairav sculpture, also known as Baghairav,
Right.
and describe a large reservoir or pond called Cha as a dumbbounded miracle, because it has no pooling stream feeding it, yet remains full. Intriguing.
Re-emphasizing the medieval temples and stone carvings at Bhaktapur Durbar Square, highlighting the sheer skill and effort that went into them.
It's a testament to centuries of dedicated craftsmanship. Really stunning stuff.
Beyond these tangible arts, Nepal also has a deep tradition of literature and folklore.
Yes, The sources discuss a centuries-old tradition of creating literature across genres in Nepali and other languages, reflecting the ethnic diversity and, at times, the strife.
The content goes far beyond just literary topics, doesn't it? Touching on sociology, history, economics, geography, politics, culture, philosophy.
It's broad. Genres cover everything from novels, short stories, dramas, and travelogues to children's works and critical writings. The sources note that many handwritten and unpublished works still exist, lots potentially hidden away.
A particularly significant part mentioned is the sizable body of folk literature.
Yes, shaped by oral transmission, reflecting people's lives, their quests, their exposure to contemporary life. The sources describe folklore as a vital ingredient in shaping social life, expressing a hope that's often tied closely to nature. The country's diversity and its historical relations with Tibet, India, and others have clearly influenced folklore's many forms.
And folk tales, folk songs, and ballads are seen as closely tied to the essence of ethnic and tribal cultures.
They are. But while this richness has attracted intellectual curiosity from researchers, the sources make a critical point. Nepal's folklore has rarely been discussed nationally or internationally to the extent it deserves.
And perhaps more concerning, the sources state that folklore is, quote, forsaken from the field of creative writing, lacks an advocate, and that initiatives to publish it systematically in indigenous scripts have seldom taken initiatives, leaving it obscure and sealed.
It's framed as a significant cultural loss or neglect, potentially leaving vast amounts of cultural knowledge and expression locked away, which is a real shame. The sources also mention common beliefs among simple hill people in a greater being, forces, divinity, and even evils haunting them, sometimes leading to the worship of figures described as brutes and spectral beings, reflecting a worldview where ordinary human pursuits might be seen as superficial.
Let's move to another aspect of Nepali life, sports and recreation.
Okay. The sources acknowledge Nepal's incredible potential for outdoor adventure sports. Thanks to its geography, those river systems perfect for rafting, possibilities for paragliding and ultralight planes, all that potential.
But they make a key point. The availability of facilities doesn't automatically guarantee growth.
Right. They argue that socio-political and cultural processes are more significant in determining why modern sports haven't fully embedded themselves across society. It's not just about having the gear or the place.
The sources do note Nepal's early role in initiating organized sports in South Asia, mentioning volleyball and hockey in 1932.
Yeah, and football and table tennis associations in 1943. Quite early, actually.
And they link the history of modern sports in Nepal to the rise of modern regimes, attempting to claim modernity for themselves by promoting sport as a new way of life.
Sort of using sports for nation building or image building.
Right. However, they highlight a clear inconsistency between these stated goals and the actual practice, suggesting this has bred informal and secretive politics and rife commercialism within the sports sector.
So despite constraints like difficult terrain, poverty, illiteracy, and strong traditions, games are played actively. But the sources lament the lack of systematic study around them.
Okay.
They even note that the history of game playing as an economic or military strategy isn't well documented or appreciated, which is an interesting angle.
The involvement in games, viewed as a way people structure their time, does indicate sociocultural aspects of the Nepali psyche, environment, and realities.
Absolutely. And the sources call for serious archival work to understand how Nepali games were traditionally played, under what conditions, and how they've changed over time. More research needed, basically.
Shifting focus again, what do the sources tell us about Nepal's health system?
They describe it as a mix of public and private healthcare providers. There's been a stated focus on primary healthcare development for over 2 decades, policy, efforts to extend services.
The government has also been moving towards national health insurance, NHI, and universal health coverage, UHC.
Right. The NHI policy was passed in January 2014, and the first phase was launched in 4 districts, including Kashiski. Implementation is ongoing with plans for expansion via the Health Insurance Board.
What are the key challenges mentioned regarding this NHI scheme?
Well, the sources highlight that the scheme currently covers only basic services, limited to just 40 essential drugs, which is pretty limited.
Very basic package. And access to outpatient care, particularly for poor people, remains limited.
Yes, and the sources note this is largely provided by the private sector. A major challenge for the NHI is the lack of formal private sector engagement. It's not really integrated.
So people are paying out of pocket.
Mostly, yeah. Out-of-pocket expenditure is still the primary way most people finance their healthcare.
The sources mention the influence of the 1978 Alma-Ata Declaration on Health Policy.
Yes, that international declaration emphasized primary healthcare, which shaped Nepal's initiatives in that area. However, from the early 1990s, following liberalization and the restoration of democracy,
Things changed.
the public sector provision was increasingly supplemented by private providers. The sources note the obvious growth in urban areas, but also a less visible growth of private healthcare in rural and remote regions, too.
This brings us to perhaps the most crucial section from the sources, the overarching challenges Nepal faces, and what the sources describe as the long road to stability.
Yeah, the economic picture presented is quite challenging. Remittances from abroad are significant, accounting for around 29% of GDP, according to the sources.
That's a huge chunk.
It is. But the overall ratio of financial transfers to GDP is still low compared to neighboring countries.
And the high import to GDP ratio, over 35%, seems to be a major problem.
It is. This creates a large current account deficit, necessitating continuous currency depreciation for the Nepali rupee against currencies like the US dollar.
Which hits people's wallets.
Exactly. The sources directly link this declining purchasing power to social unrest and conflict.
Nepal is categorized among the least developed countries, with a low GDP and a persistently low growth rate, around 4% over decades.
And the sources state flatly that resources haven't been utilized properly. They strongly connect these economic issues to the pervasive political instability that has plagued Nepal since the fall of the Rana autocracy in the 1950s.
Highlighting frequent conflicts between rulers and common people.
Yes. After the king dissolved parliament in 1960, the country endured about 30 years of direct rule under what the sources call extractive systems.
Meaning
Systems designed to extract wealth for the ruling elite rather than broad development. These only ended in the late 1980s due to popular movements advocating for democracy.
the reinstatement of the parliamentary system in 1990 seemed to offer real hope.
It did. The sources describe it as a change promising democracy and inclusive development. But this period of parliamentary democracy, lasting about 10 years, it was marked by instability.
Right.
And ultimately disrupted first by the Mallas conflict and then the royal coup in 2002, returning the country to direct palace autocracy.
Where the king again dissolved parliament in 2002 and ruled directly until relinquishing power during the massive 2006 protests.
Right. And the sources note that even after 2006, there were 8 years of intense negotiations aimed at peace, inclusion, and writing a new constitution. But that the necessary political agreement somehow just disappeared.
Just evaporated.
That's the sense you get from the source, a failure to reach consensus.
The new phase following the 2015 Constitution is described as a historic revolution, even compared in the source to the French Revolution or the fall of the Berlin Wall, for fundamentally sweeping away the monarchy.
Which began under joint initiatives, but as we discussed, the sources emphasize that this hasn't yet translated into political stability, not by a long shot. The conclusion section of the sources also includes a quite direct point about what they see as the adverse impacts of adopting Western concepts on Nepal's specific geography, demography, and culture.
And challenges are attributed to geography, unutilized natural resources, historical ethnic diversity seen as an obstacle to integration, and what the sources refer to using the phrase wild tribal mentality, which they describe as obstructing politics. That's a very strong phrase.
Yes, that's a striking and potentially controversial phrase used within the source text itself. It seems intended to characterize one perspective on the difficulties in political integration.
Okay.
And the sources link this perceived issue to political parties post-1950s failing to grasp the country's fundamental problems, leading to periods of partyless rule and stagnation. They also point to externally imposed development policies that fulfilled foreign interests but failed the masses.
So despite the promise of fundamental changes in 1990 and some rights being ensured, the socioeconomic situation hasn't broadly improved.
That's what the sources conclude, unfortunately. Disparity, deprivation, and social malice rooted in gender, caste, ethnicity, and poverty have persisted.
Still there.
Still there. They argue that hierarchy, an autocratic mindset, unbalanced development, and inequity have limited Nepal's ability to compete globally. And mismanagement of globalization has even led to internal disruption. Efforts for basic rights and livelihoods for historically neglected segments of the population, according to the sources, just haven't fully succeeded.
Wow, that was a deep dive indeed. We've journeyed from the staggering heights of the Himalayas down to the fertile Terai plains, sifted through layers of history from ancient stones to debated modern constitutions.
The sources we explored have really helped distill this incredibly complex narrative, haven't they? Revealing not just the diverse ways of life and immense beauty, but also the recurring patterns of historical struggle, political upheaval, and those persistent challenges the country faces.
Nepal is truly a land of immense natural beauty and deep cultural roots, but as this material shows, it's a nation marked by a turbulent past and an ongoing, often difficult pursuit of stability and prosperity.
Yeah. Given the recurring themes throughout these sources, the incredible resilience and richness found in deep traditions, like its cultural heritage preservation and vibrant festivals, contrasted with the persistent cycle of political instability since the mid-20th century, here's something to ponder.
Okay.
What unique synthesis of its historical strengths and its modern aspirations will ultimately define Nepal's future? Could elements drawn from its rich, resilient past actually hold keys to navigating its present challenges and building a more stable tomorrow? Something to think about.